All right, everyone, before I dive into this story, tell me, from which city are you watching tonight? I love knowing where everyone's tuning in from. Whether it's the quiet corners of Maine or the sunny stretches of California, it always makes me feel like we're sitting together on one big, cozy couch. And hey, if you enjoy these little slices of life I share, don't forget to subscribe and tap that like button, not just because it helps the channel, but because it lets me know you're here, listening, and maybe even feeling a bit of what I felt that evening. Now, let's get into it. That night started out like any other. I had just finished cleaning up after dinner, a simple roast chicken, nothing fancy, and was sitting down with a cup of chamomile tea when the doorbell rang. My son Aaron had mentioned earlier that he might have a few friends over to watch the game. I didn't think much of it. After all, he's 30 now, but every once in a while, he and his old college buddies like to drop by. It's funny how boys never quite grow out of that easy laughter and backslapping camaraderie. When I opened the door, Aaron came in first, grinning like he was still 16. Behind him was his friend, Michael. Tall, well-kept, with that kind of calm confidence that only seems to come with time. I hadn't seen him in years, not since they'd both been in their 20s. But there he was, holding a bottle of wine, smiling politely as he said, "Good evening, Mrs. Carter." Mrs. Carter. It's strange how that title still makes me feel like someone's mother, not like my own person. I smiled and told him to call me Diane. He laughed softly and said, "All right, Diane. I'll try to remember that." The game played on in the background while I moved around the kitchen, half listening to their laughter, half thinking about how empty the house had been lately. It had been almost 10 years since my husband passed. Aaron lived across town, and most days it was just me, the ticking clock, and the sound of the neighbor's dog barking at shadows. Eventually, Aaron got a call, some emergency at work. He's always on the move, always busy. He apologized, told Michael to stay and finish the game, and promised he'd swing by the next day. So it ended up being just the two of us. I remember sitting on the couch, the soft hum of the TV filling the silence. I could smell the faint trace of his cologne, something woodsy and warm like cedar and smoke. It mixed with the scent of the candles I had lit earlier. There was nothing unusual about it, but still the air felt different. A bit heavier, maybe. He asked me how I'd been, how I was managing the house alone. I told him the truth, that I was doing fine, mostly. Gardening, volunteering, reading more than I used to. He nodded, listening intently, not rushing the conversation. It felt nice, like someone was really hearing me for once. When he sat down next to me, I noticed how close he was, not in a way that felt wrong, but in a way that reminded me how long it had been since anyone had sat that close at all. His knee brushed mine lightly as he reached for the bowl of popcorn, and I laughed nervously, making some silly comment about personal space. He smiled. "Sorry, old habits," he said, and his eyes softened. "You always made the best popcorn." He used to sneak into the kitchen after Aaron went to bed just to grab another handful. That memory tugged something deep inside me. I hadn't thought about those nights in years, those long summers when the boys would stay up too late playing video games, and I'd tell them to quiet down or at least eat something that wasn't pizza. Time had a way of blurring it all together, until moments like this made it come back sharp and clear. We talked more. About life, about getting older, about how strange it is to look in the mirror and still feel 20 inside. He laughed and said he knew exactly what I meant. Then there was a pause. One of those comfortable silences that feels like it says more than words ever could. He leaned back, resting one arm along the back of the couch, and I could feel the warmth of his shoulder near mine. I told myself it was nothing, just a friendly evening, just two people talking. But something about his tone, the way he looked at me when I spoke, made it feel like he saw me, really saw me. Not just as Aaron's mother, or as a widow keeping busy, but as a woman. And it had been such a long time since I felt that. When the game ended, the house was quiet again. I reached for the remote, but he gently took it from my hand and said, "Leave it. It's nice just sitting here like this." His voice was calm, steady, but there was an emotion underneath it I couldn't quite name. For a moment, I wondered if I should stand up, make tea, change the subject, anything to break that charged stillness. But instead, I stayed. Outside, the rain began to fall, soft and steady against the windows. Inside, the light from the lamp cast a warm glow that seemed to wrap around us. We talked again about loss, about how people move on, about the little things that make life bearable after heartbreak. He told me he'd gone through something similar, a long relationship that had ended badly, leaving him wary and alone. Maybe that's why it felt so natural to open up, to tell him things I hadn't told anyone in years, the kind of truths you usually keep tucked away behind polite smiles and small talk. At one point, he said quietly, "You have this calm about you, Diane. It's comforting." I don't know what came over me then, but I laughed softly and said, "That's one way of saying I'm old." He shook his head. "No, that's one way of saying you're real." Something inside me shifted then, a flicker of warmth I hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't about attraction, not exactly. It was about being seen, being valued, being human again. We sat there for a while longer, the rain pattering outside, the scent of coffee and candle wax in the air. He didn't move closer, and neither did I. It was just enough. Later, when he stood to leave, he thanked me for the company, for the conversation. I walked him to the door, and before stepping out, he paused and said, "You're easy to talk to, Diane. I didn't realize how much I needed that tonight." After he left, I stood by the window, watching the rain trail down the glass. The house felt warm, alive somehow, like a part of it had woken up after a long sleep. I didn't know then what would come next. I only knew that something had changed in me, something small but undeniable. And as I turned off the lamp and headed upstairs, I found myself smiling, not because of what had happened, but because for the first time in years I felt seen. The next morning, the house felt quieter than usual. The kind of quiet that settles in after something you can't quite name has shifted in the air. I stood by the window with my coffee, looking out at the drizzle that had carried through the night. The world looked washed clean, pale light on wet pavement, the smell of damp earth rising from the garden beds I'd been meaning to weed. I thought about Michael more than I wanted to admit. It wasn't just the conversation. It was the ease of it, the warmth in his voice, the way he listened like every word I said mattered. There was something grounding in that. I'd spent years being polite, strong, measured, but last night I had let the edges of that careful composure soften, and I didn't regret it. Around noon, my phone buzzed with a message. "Thank you again for last night. I hope I didn't overstay my welcome." I smiled. He hadn't. Not by a long shot. I typed back, "You're welcome anytime." The company was nice. Then I set the phone down, feeling a little foolish for how much thought I'd put into that single line. Still, it felt right. Honest. Later that afternoon, Aaron called to apologize for bailing. He promised he'd make it up to me next weekend. I told him it was fine, that Michael had stayed, and we'd watch the rest of the game. There was a pause on the line, a small, surprised sound in his voice. "Oh, that's nice," he said. "I didn't know you two talked much." I laughed it off. "We caught up? It's been a while since I saw any of you boys. You've all grown into men somehow." He chuckled, then moved on to another topic, and soon after, the call ended. But that small pause lingered with me, not because of what he said, but because it reminded me that I hadn't seen Michael as one of the boys last night. Not really. That evening, I decided to take a walk. The air had that crisp, late autumn chill, the kind that makes your breath hang in the air like a soft ghost. I pulled on a scarf and wandered down the familiar street, the one lined with old maple trees that had already shed most of their leaves. When I passed the small cafe on the corner, I saw him through the window. Sitting alone, a newspaper folded beside his coffee. He spotted me almost at once, and before I could decide whether to wave or keep walking, he was already on his feet, smiling that same calm, easy smile. "Diane," he said as I stepped inside, shaking the rain from my coat, "I was just thinking about you." I laughed softly. "That's a coincidence. I was just thinking about coffee." He offered to buy me one, and I didn't argue. We found a small table near the window, and as we talked, the hours seemed to slip away unnoticed. The conversation was different this time, lighter, easier, filled with small jokes and shared glances that carried a warmth I couldn't quite define. He told me about his work, how he'd been feeling stuck lately, about his mother, who had passed a few years back, and how much he missed her voice when things got hard. I told him about the garden I'd been tending since my husband's death, how the soil had become a kind of therapy, something alive that needed care, patience, and quiet attention. When he listened, it wasn't out of obligation. It felt like connection, two people reaching across their own silences to meet in the middle. As the cafe emptied and the sun slipped lower, I realized I hadn't felt this kind of peace in years. It wasn't excitement or nervousness. It was something gentler, deeper. Before we left, he asked if he could walk me home. It was only a few blocks, but I didn't say no. The streetlights had come on, spilling golden circles of light onto the damp sidewalk. We walked in silence for a while, our steps in rhythm, the soft sound of our shoes brushing against the wet leaves. When we reached my gate, I turned to thank him, expecting the evening to end with the same polite warmth as before. But he hesitated, his eyes searching mine for a moment longer than felt ordinary. "Can I tell you something?" he asked. "Of course," I said. "I didn't realize how much I missed this," he said quietly. "Just talking to someone who listens. It's rare." I could feel my heart beat against the soft wool of my scarf. "I understand," I said. "It's rare for me, too." He nodded, his gaze soft. "You have a way of making silence feel comfortable." I smiled at that, a small, private smile that felt like it belonged only to us in that moment. "Maybe that's age," I said, half joking. He shook his head. "No, that's kindness." There wasn't much more to say after that. He wished me good night, and I watched him walk away until his figure blurred into the fog that had begun to rise from the street. When I went inside, I felt a curious mix of calm and restlessness. I sat on the couch, the same spot where we talked the night before, and the room seemed to hum with the echo of his voice. It wasn't love, not yet. It wasn't even infatuation. It was something slower, steadier, a quiet stirring that made me aware of the years that had passed and the ones still ahead. I thought about the way his eyes softened when he spoke about his mother, the way he had listened when I spoke about the garden. There was no rush in it, no pretense, just two people learning to breathe in the same rhythm again. That night, as I drifted off to sleep, I found myself smiling. Not because anything had happened, but because something was beginning. Something that felt gentle, patient, something that made the world seem a little warmer again. I didn't know where it would lead, but for the first time in a long while, I wanted to find out. The following week slipped by quietly, like a soft wind moving through the curtains, barely noticed until it was gone. I went about my usual routines, watering the plants, tidying the kitchen, sorting through old photo albums I'd promised myself I'd organize one day. But beneath all of it, there was this steady hum, a lingering thought that circled back to Michael again and again. He didn't call right away, and I didn't expect him to. But when his name finally appeared on my phone that Thursday afternoon, I felt a small rush of warmth, the kind that catches you off guard when you've spent years convincing yourself you're past such things. He asked if I'd like to have dinner. Not out somewhere loud or fancy, but at his place. "I owe you one," he said, his voice light, "for all the popcorn and stories last time." I hesitated, just for a second. Then I said yes. That evening, I found myself standing at his front door with a small bouquet of daisies, the only flowers I could find that didn't feel like a statement. His home was warm, understated, and smelled faintly of roasted garlic and herbs. The sound of soft jazz floated in the background, and when he opened the door, he looked, well, comfortable. Not dressed up, not trying too hard, just himself. "Wow," he said, taking the flowers with a grin. "You didn't have to bring these." "I know," I said, "but it felt right." We moved easily into the rhythm of the evening. He cooked, I set the table. We talked about small things at first, the neighbors, the changing seasons, the kind of light that comes through the windows just before dusk. But slowly, the conversation deepened. He asked about my husband. It wasn't prying, just curious in a respectful way. I told him the truth, that John had been a good man, steady and kind, and that losing him had felt like losing the ground beneath my feet. "I'm sorry," Michael said softly. I nodded. "It's all right. Time reshapes the grief, you know. It never leaves, but it softens. It becomes part of the air around you. You learn to live inside it." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "I think that's the most honest thing I've ever heard about loss." We didn't speak for a while after that. The quiet between us wasn't awkward. It was full. It felt like something real had settled there, a shared understanding neither of us had expected. Dinner was simple. Grilled salmon, vegetables, and a small bottle of white wine he said he'd been saving. We talked, laughed, drifted between stories and silences that seemed to stretch comfortably, like well-worn fabric. At one point, he reached for the bottle to refill my glass, and his fingers brushed mine. Just a small touch. But it sent something through me. Not a spark exactly, but a deep reminder that I was still here, still part of a world where connection could happen unexpectedly. After dinner, we moved to the living room. The rain had started again. It seemed to follow us, a quiet rhythm in the background. He poured coffee and we sat across from each other, legs curled under us, the low light casting soft shadows on the walls. He asked about the garden again, about what I planted, what grew well, what didn't. I told him about the roses I'd tried and failed to keep alive, about the stubborn hydrangeas that refused to bloom. He smiled and said, "Maybe they just need patience." Everything does eventually. We talked about patience then, how hard it was to practice it in life, in love, in waiting for things to heal. He said he'd spent years rushing from one thing to another, thinking that motion was the same as progress. But lately he'd been learning to slow down. There was something in his eyes when he said it, a kind of stillness that felt both fragile and strong. It made me want to hold the moment gently, as if any sudden movement might scare it away. Eventually, the conversation quieted again. I leaned back into the couch, feeling the weight of the day settle into my shoulders. The sound of the rain deepened, and the warmth of the room wrapped around us like a soft blanket. He looked at me then, really looked, the way someone might study the details of a photograph they'd seen before, but only now began to understand. "You're different than I remembered," he said. "How so?" "You used to feel like Aaron's mom, kind, welcoming, always making sure everyone was comfortable. But now," he paused, his gaze steady, "now you feel like someone I could talk to about everything. Someone who's lived." I didn't know what to say to that. It wasn't flattery, it was recognition. And somehow, that meant more. "Life has a way of changing us," I said finally. "Sometimes quietly, sometimes all at once." He nodded. "And sometimes It takes someone else to notice it. The room went still again. The sound of the rain, the quiet hum of the music, it all seemed to fade into the background. There was a sense of understanding, of gratitude, maybe even affection. But it wasn't rushed or loud. It was gentle. When I stood to leave, he walked me to the door. The rain had eased, leaving the air cool and fresh. I turned to say goodbye, but for a moment neither of us spoke. He simply said, "Thank you, Diane, for tonight, for being you." I smiled. "You're welcome, Michael." And then something small but significant. He reached out and lightly touched my hand. Not a lingering touch, just a quiet acknowledgement. I could feel the warmth of his palm, the steadiness of it. As I walked home under the dim glow of the streetlights, I realized that something had quietly taken root between us. Not romance, not yet, but something with the shape of it. Something that might, given time, become something deeper. When I got home, I hung my coat by the door and paused for a long moment, listening to the faint sound of the rain against the roof. I felt a calmness I hadn't known in years. It wasn't just about him. It was about being reminded that life still held surprises, quiet, meaningful ones that slipped in when you weren't looking. That night, I went to bed with the window open, letting the cool air fill the room. I slept deeply, and for the first time in a long time, I dreamed, not of the past, but of something just beginning to unfold. The days that followed felt like a slow unfolding, soft, deliberate, like the petals of a flower opening after a long winter. There was no rush, no sudden declarations or confessions, just a quiet rhythm of small moments that began to shape themselves into something meaningful. Michael started stopping by the house now and then. Sometimes it was to bring me a bag of fresh lemons from the market, or to help me carry a box up from the basement, or simply to share a cup of coffee on the porch. Each visit felt easy, unhurried. We talked about everything and nothing. How his week had gone, what I was planting in the garden, how quickly time seemed to pass once you stopped counting the days. One afternoon, he showed up with a small clay pot in his hands. Inside it was a young hydrangea, a fragile, hopeful green against the dark soil. "For your garden," he said, "you mentioned you couldn't get them to bloom. Maybe this one will listen." I laughed. Maybe it just needed the right company. We planted it together near the fence, where the morning sun could reach it. The ground was soft from recent rain, and as he knelt beside me, our hands brushed in the dirt. We didn't look at each other right away, just worked quietly, the smell of earth and grass all around us. When we finally did glance up, it was one of those moments that needed no words. That evening after he left, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea and watched the sky turn from gold to lavender. The world felt calm, alive. And somewhere in that stillness, I realized that what we had, whatever it was becoming, wasn't about filling an empty space. It was about finding peace in presence. A week later, Aaron stopped by. It was a Sunday, one of those lazy, bright mornings that smell of coffee and toast. He noticed the hydrangea right away. "Wow," he said, crouching beside it. "You finally got one to grow." I smiled. I had some help. He looked up, curious. "Michael?" I nodded. There was a brief pause, not awkward, but full of something unspoken. Then he said, "He's a good guy, Mom. Always liked him." "I know," I said softly. "He's been kind." Aaron studied me for a moment, then smiled. That knowing, gentle smile only a grown child gives when they realize their parent has a world beyond them. "I'm glad," he said. "You deserve some kindness." After he left, I found myself thinking about how life rarely gives us second chances in loud, dramatic ways. More often, it offers them quietly, through small connections, shared silences, the courage to open your heart again after years of being careful. That evening, Michael called. His voice was warm, familiar. "I was thinking," he said, "you should see how well your hydrangea's doing. It's thriving." I laughed. "It's our hydrangea now, isn't it?" He chuckled. "I'll take partial credit." He invited me for dinner again, but this time it wasn't about catching up or saying thank you. It felt simple, natural, the next step in a rhythm that had been building gently between us. When I arrived, the air smelled of rosemary and lemon. He had set the table outside on the small patio, candles flickering in glass jars, the faint hum of crickets in the background. We ate slowly, talked quietly, and when the conversation drifted into silence, it wasn't empty. It was full of everything that didn't need to be said aloud. After dinner, we sat side by side, watching the last of the light fade behind the trees. He turned to me then, his expression thoughtful. "You've changed my idea of what connection looks like," he said. "I used to think it had to be fast, full of noise and excitement. But this feels real." I looked at him, feeling the truth of it settle deep in my chest. "Real things usually grow quietly," I said. "They take time." He reached for my hand, slow, steady, and held it there between us. Not as a question, not as a promise, but as a simple truth. We sat like that for a long while. No rush, no expectation. Just two people who had found each other at the right time. Not when they were searching, but when they had finally learned how to see. Later that night, when I got home, I stood by the window and looked out at the hydrangea. The moonlight made its leaves glow faintly silver. It wasn't blooming yet, but it would. I could feel it. As I turned off the lights and went upstairs, I thought about how life has a way of surprising you when you least expect it. Sometimes it doesn't give you back what you lost. It gives you something different. Something you didn't know you needed until it arrived quietly on your doorstep with a smile and a bag of lemons. And in that soft stillness, I understood something I hadn't in years, that love, in all its forms, doesn't always have to arrive loudly to be real. Sometimes it just sits beside you on the couch, brings you a flower for your garden, and helps you remember that you are still very much alive.